it's more likely than not that Douglas Harris was murdered in 1948. I would not be able to prove that he was murdered beyond a reasonable doubt in a court proceeding. I cannot identify his attacker or attackers with the probable cause that a police agency would need to make an arrest. I'm now going to read the police log, which is one of the very important documents describing the death of Douglas Harris. Norwich Police Log, Saturday, November 20th, 1948. 5:05 p.m., Dr. Phillips phoned us to report that Ms. Harris, 20 Hammond Avenue, called him and told him her husband came home last night drunk. She asked him to go get some water out of the well so she could wash some diapers. He started to quarrel. He said he was going down the street. That is the last she saw of him until tonight when she went to the well and thought she saw his shoes on the water. Sent Carr and Lobats there, who reported that Douglas Harris, 20 Hammond Avenue, was at the bottom of a 15-foot well with about 3 feet of water in it, with his feet illegible. Notified Deputy Coroner Cassidy and the medical examiner, Dr. Arch Abundo, all sent the fire department to get him out of the well. Thomas Sheehan, a funeral home director, took charge of the body. Douglas Harris has a wife, Marion, and one child, 2 years old. His wife told Officer Lobats that he left the house at 8:30 p.m. He was feeling pretty good when he left. She thought he might have been arrested. When she went to the well at 4 p.m. today, she saw his shoes over the water in the well. This is a medical examiner's report to the coroner. The wife claims that they had an argument at 8:30 p.m. and she told him he ought to get some water for the wash. He stormed out of the house saying he was going downtown. He did not return that night, but she did not think much of it because he often did that. On November 20th at 4:30 p.m., she went out to the well to get some water, and looking into the well, she saw a pair of shoes which were his. Dr. Phillips was called and he called the police. Examination at the scene showed an open well, narrow, stone-lined, and about 20 feet deep. It contained about 3 feet of water. Jackknifed at the bottom of the well with the feet and thighs up was a body. The mid-thigh to the head were underwater. The fire department lassoed the leg and brought the body to the surface. The clothing consisted of a shirt, pants, stockings, and shoes. The stripped body shows that the lungs are full of water. There are 3 depressed areas of the skull, 1 of the left front area, 2 right temporal, 3 left parietal. These areas are surrounded by a small area of edema. They are abrasions on the back, right elbow and knee, left elbow and knee. Opinion: it would seem that he had fallen headfirst into the well and had landed on some stones which caused the depression of the skull, and the struggle would give the abrasions of the elbow and knees. He died of drowning. The Norwich Bulletin also wrote an article on this incident. It was published November 21st, 1948. The headline says, "Hammond Avenue Negro drowns in well alongside house." It should be noted that the well was not alongside the house. It was 168 feet away, which indicates the reporter never actually went to the scene. It said, Dr. Archibald expressed, quote, "the opinion that Harris lost his balance while bending over the top of the well and plunged into head first. This conclusion was based on the fact that the man sustained an injury to his skull and also abrasions." There is one other account of that evening which I'll mention. It's from a book of Ellis Ruley's life experiences, which was written by Delois Lindsay and Sheila Trainham. It's called A Promise to My Mother, the saga of the Ellis Walter Ruley family. Gladys wasn't at the house that evening. She later got various details from other family members who were. The account she tells is pretty much the same account that's in the police report and the medical examiner's report, with some additional details, such as when Douglas Harris left for town. He put his jacket on. When he was found in the well later, he was not wearing his jacket. The other thing it also mentions is that he knew the well area very well. And when he would go there at night, he would typically bring a lantern, which makes a lot of sense. The other thing it mentioned is that Ellis Ruley was not at the house at 8:30 that evening. He came back a couple hours later and told Marion that he thought that her husband would be back sometime that evening. Dr. Michael Baden did a presentation in Norwich in 2015 based on the exhumation and autopsy he did of Douglas Harris. Baden is a world-famous pathologist. He used to work for the city of New York and also the state of New York. On October 17, 2014, he did an autopsy of Douglas Harris's fully skeletonized remains. He found a half-inch diameter V-shaped perforation of the outer table of the skull just above the medial aspect of the right orbit that extended to the midline of the skull but not through the skull bone. A perforation through the skin of the forehead was not described in the original medical examiner's external description of Mr. Harris. Let's listen to some of his comments.
However, there was one finding that couldn't have happened that way. He did have a fracture of the windpipe of the hyoid bone. The left hyoid bone was fractured. That only can happen with compression of the neck. Now, the medical examiner, the doctor who signed the death certificate and didn't do an autopsy, determined that the cause of death was drowning, fell into well, accident, and he said he felt 3 fractures of the skull from falling into the well. There weren't any fractures of the skull where he fell on. There was a perforation in the front of the forehead, which could be due to trauma, could be in life, or could be due to just decomposition over 66 years. But the fracture of the hyoid bone could not be due to decomposition. And that's the hallmark that medical examiners use for strangulation homicide cases. Now, it makes sense then to me that when comparing the fractured hyoid bone with the diagnosis of drowning because there was a lot of froth coming out of the nose and mouth, according to the doctor who issued the death certificate, if he were conscious, and in order to have the froth coming out of the nose and mouth, and to drown, he has to be alive, breathing. He has to breathe in the water. If he is alive and conscious, he's able to struggle, and it would be very hard to shove him into a well, which is a narrow well, and if he's conscious. That's why adults don't get accidentally injured going down wells. But if he were first strangled, the strangulation caused him to lose consciousness and will in itself cause death. But while he's still breathing and conscious, going deeper, deeper coma, then is placed into the well without any struggle or anything, that would make sense, that there was some kind of a struggle, whether one person or more than one person. He loses consciousness and then gets placed into the well, and that's how the doctor found him, who was the coroner at the time. You can have drowning in somebody who's unconscious, but not somebody who's big and can struggle and who is conscious. So in my opinion, this clearly is evidence that Douglas Harris did die of homicidal causes, not of accidental drowning, but of both strangulation and drowning that was homicidal.
Later, Dr. James Gill, who is the chief medical examiner of the state of Connecticut, reviewed Dr. Baden's reports, and he disagreed with Dr. Baden. The gist of Dr. Gill's response is that he asked their forensic anthropologist to review the findings and the x-rays, and she could not state that the left wing of the hyoid bone was fractured, as she could not examine it in person. It had actually been reburied with Douglas Harris, and because the location of the break or fracture is at a bone fusion point, that sometimes does not fuse. In other words, in some individuals, that particular location does not firmly attach to the rest of the bone. Given the lack of circumstances and the hyoid issues, it would be difficult to state to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that he was strangled. The absence of a skull fracture does not affect the manner of death. A person could be strangled and dropped into a well and still not get a skull fracture. On the other hand, there are other potential causes of death, drowning, positional asphyxia, that are reasonable. Dr. Gill goes on, without knowing more circumstances, it is not possible to reach a reasonable degree of medical certainty to change Douglas Harris's manner of death to homicide. I am perplexed by their determination of the cause of death as being both strangulation and drowning. If he was alive and inhaling water in the well, he was not strangled to death. If it is indeed a hyoid fracture, it will be evidence of neck compression and would likely affect the manner of death, but the cause of death would still be drowning. I should also add that typically diagnoses of drowning are determinations of exclusion. A medical examiner will typically examine someone who is thought to have drowned and exclude any other causes. In present practice, you do not say that someone drowned without conducting a full autopsy. The town medical examiner who looked at Douglas Harris in 1948 did a visual examination. By our standards today, that is grossly substandard. They did not send him to a pathologist at the time. Maybe it was because they wanted to save money, but this was an incredible problem with Douglas Harris's case. I'm now going to provide an analysis of the death scene in 1948. First of all, the easiest access to the house was along a dirt and gravel driveway. It's now paved by the city of Norwich because it's now part of a park. But in the day, it was dirt and gravel. It was a steep hill. The well, which is on the other end of the property, is 155 feet from the Hammond Avenue, and it's up a 20% grade. The family at the time, if they went out after dark to go draw water from the well, would typically bring several buckets and a lantern after dark, for the obvious reason that they needed to see where they were going. There are no mentions by the town medical examiner in his description of any buckets being found underneath Douglas Harris. If the ME was theorizing that this was an accident and Douglas Harris fell into the well while trying to draw water, why would there not be a bucket or buckets found underneath his body? It's possible they found them and did not record this, even though it does support their theory that it was an accident, but it is a gross lack of documentation. Similarly, if a lantern had been found next to the well, that would have also supported the claim that this was an accidental death. One of the things which was not in the report was a question by the medical examiner to the family members: did you move anything after the death? Yes, no, or yes, we brought the lamp back to the house. There's a chronology issue with Marion Harris's account of what happened that evening. She needed water to clean her baby's diaper. Her husband wasn't available. She didn't go outside that night. Understandably, there was a hard rain. The rain lifted about 10 a.m. the next morning. She did not go out to obtain this water to clean her baby's diaper. She did not ask Ellis or Wilhelmina, who were also in the house, to do so. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12, 1, 2, 3. She goes at 4. The reason for this delay may have been lost in time, but on the other hand, it's an issue because I cannot figure out why she would have taken so long to go draw water to clean her child's diaper the next day. It's an issue, and what it did is it had the effect of delaying the police response till after dark. There's not a logical explanation for why this happened in the surviving records. When the police, deputy coroner, and the assistant medical examiner arrived, they could not have been at Hammond Avenue before 5:05 p.m. because that's when the call came into the station. It was already dark. Twilight had ended, and they would have been working at the site using the flashlights of the day, which were all low powered by our standards today. In other words, they couldn't see very much. So the investigation happened in the dark. Under these conditions, certain things may have been missed. Obviously, they should have gone back there during the daylight, even if they thought it was an accident, to get further information. They did not do so. Douglas Harris was not found wearing a jacket when he was in the well. If the description by Gladys was accurate, the question becomes, what would have happened to his jacket? That's an unanswered question. The well on the Ellis Ruley property had a narrow opening. Glenn Smith, who was the only person I'm aware of who measured it, said it was 20 by 19 inches. That's narrow. It would have been difficult for Harris, who was at least 6 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller, and weighed between 200 and 220 pounds, to fit himself down that well. Similarly, it would have been difficult for him to end up in it head first versus feet first in terms of stepping into it via an accident. It was also a well which did not have a large superstructure above the ground. Very few people would have known of its existence and could have located it in the dark.